Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Gossips 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The morning of the burial actualized with an uneasy stillness that sounded to transcend into every corner of Los Angeles. The sky hung low, heavy with shadows that hovered rain, as if the Welkin themselves were mourning. The Forrester family, habituated to luxury, power and control, set up themselves helpless against the drift of grief that now coursed through them. The manse, generally brimming with life and horselaugh, felt concave, nearly portentous, its walls echoing with the absence of the bone they had come to recognize. It was rare to see Ridge, Steffi, and Brooke together in one place without some underpinning pressure, but that pressure was replaced by a participated, eating query. They gathered in the satiny black buses lined up outside the tabernacle, the silence inside each vehicle more satisfying than any words could be. Brooke, despite her decades of experience navigating family heads, felt a lump in her throat she couldn't swallow down. She brushed a hand against her casket, nearly as if holding herself together physically could stave off the emotional collapse hanging to break her. Ridge sat beside her, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly it paled his knuckles, his jaw set in symptomatic severity. For a man who thrived on perfection and countenance, this kind of raw grief left him exposed. Indeed, Steffi, who frequently carried herself with the steely resoluteness of someone born to command, sounded lowered under the weight of the moment. She goggled out the window, tracing the edges of the brewing tabernacle, trying to summon some sense of clarity in the haze of anguish that clouded her mind. The burial itself was a grand affair, befitting someone whose life had touched so numerous, yet intimate enough to remind each attendee of the fragility of mortal connection. The room smelled noiselessly of lilies, their white petals a stark discrepancy against the dimmed black vesture of the mourners. The chorus, solemn and ethereal, filled the air with a haunting air that sounded to pull at the veritably heartstrings of everyone present. As the guests took their seats, murmurs gurgled through the crowd, whispers of unbelief and remorse. Among them were familiar faces from the intricate web of Forrester Alliance's contrivers, rivals, former suckers, and estranged family members, all gathered in reticent solidarity. The weight of the day's grief was compounded by an turnabout of implied pressure. There were secrets among them, half-trueness, and resentments that hovered to surface at the most precocious moment. Ridge, who had spent important of his life defending the family name, felt an unusual stitch of vulnerability as the casket was wheeled into the tabernacle. It wasn't just the loss itself, but the way it laid bare every fracture in their family dynamic. He caught Brooke's eye and, for a transitory alternate, felt the comforting reliability of participated grief, only to see the faintest flicker of guilt cross her expression. Ridge had long learned to read the subtle signals Brooke emitted, a nearly inappreciable shift in posture, a tense jaw or a distracted aspect. And they all screamed louder than any words could. Steffi, seated just a many rows ahead, sounded inversely attuned to the nuances of her parents' grief, yet she carried her own secret weight, one that made the formerly tense atmosphere feel like a tense line ready to snap. As the service continued, the citations began, each one precisely drafted to recognize the life and heritage of the departed, yet each delivered with the necessary shadow of what was left undetermined. One speaker after another reported stories of liberality, charm and quiet wisdom, painting a portrayal that felt nearly too perfect, a sanitized interpretation of the person they truly knew. Those closest to the family could feel the conflict, the pressure between memory and reality, and it was nearly suffocating. Indeed, the most composed of attendees, business associates oriented to accommodations and boardroom battles, felt the emotional graveness pressing in. A memorial that life's most complicated equations couldn't be balanced with plutocrat or influence. The emotional apex came when a particular commendation was delivered, a relating of the deceased's retired acts of courage, moments known only to the inner circle of the family. It was in that moment that Ridge's countenance fractured. The subtle earthquake in his hand betrayed the depth of his grief, a raw, undressed anguish he could no longer hide. Brooke, seeing the unraveling, reached out artificially, though the gesture was both comforting and agonizing, reminding them both of all that had been lost and all that had been left unsaid. Steffi, whose sense of control had always been her guard, set up herself fighting back gashes in silence, feeling the weight of both the family's prospects and her own private guilt. Outside the tabernacle, the rain eventually began to fall, light at first, also heavier, beating against the roof like a grim memorial of the evanescence of life. It sounded nearly emblematic, washing down the superficial layers of pretense and exposing the raw mortal emotion beneath. Exchanges that followed were careful, measured, but the pressure was palpable. Conversations about business, estate matters, and unborn plans were amalgamated with implied grievances and refocused ganders, subtle monuments of old battles. Indeed, as they navigated these exchanges, each member of the Forrester family carried a private burden of reflection, questioning one's opinions and wondering what heritage they were truly leaving before. Yet, amid the anguish, there were moments of striking clarity. Steffi, walking through the tabernacle's auditorium subsequently, caught sight of a single lily lying in the wet lawn, petals glistering in the rain. The simplicity of the flower, untouched and pure, struck her with an unanticipated intensity. In that moment, she realized that grief wasn't only about loss but about the recognition of what signified most, the connections that endured indeed in absence. Ridge, standing at the edge of the route, noticed the reflection of the sky in the water, clouded and tumultuous yet able of clearing. He understood, maybe for the first time in a long while, that indeed in despair, there was a fragile stopgap for conciliation and renewal. Brooke, watching both from a distance, felt the bitter pang of remorse and the conservative motions of remission, a memorial that life, indeed in its most chaotic form, carried openings for mending. Throughout the day, the simple vestments of the Forrester saga were on full display, battles stewing beneath polite expressions, alliances being tested, and unanticipated exposures hanging to disrupt fragile bonds. And yet, amid all the bouleversement, the participated experience of mourning came an important equalizer. In the presence of death, they were no longer challengers, contrivers, or socialites. They were simply mortal beings scuffling with loss, craving, and the enduring complexity of family. It was a rare moment of concinnity, still transitory, that underlined the necessary verity. Life moved forward, shaped by grief but defined by the strength to carry on. As the final notes of the service echoed through the tabernacle, the Forresters stood together outdoors, faces barred with gashes, hearts heavy but ever lighter for having participated in the collaborative mourning. The casket was lowered, the flowers scattered, and the rain softened, leaving behind a sense of solemn check. But indeed, as they said their final farewells, the air was thick with expectation. Implied pressures, buried secrets, and undetermined conflicts promised that the coming chapter in the family saga would arrive fleetly, bringing with it both heartache and the possibility of redemption. And in that intricate cotillion of grief and adaptability, the Forresters were reminded yet again that life, in all its chaotic beauty, demanded courage, compassion, and an unvarying commitment to those who truly signified. The burial ended, but its echo would resonate through the lives of the Forresters for weeks, months, indeed times to come. Every regard changed, every word spoken, every decision made in the fate carried the weight of the day. A stark memorial that in a family as complex and integrated as theirs, no loss is ever simple, and no secret remains buried ever. Grief had opened the door, and though the storm shadows above began to part, the murk cast would loiter, silent, grim, yet incontrovertibly transformative. The sky continued to posterity over Los Angeles, a heavy Argentine cloak that pressed down on the megacity like a palpable weight. As the mourners revealed from the tabernacle, screens unfolded like an ocean of black petals, each one a small fort against the patient mizzle. Ridge, still in his immaculate dark suit, walked a many paces ahead of Brooke and Steffi, though his mind was away. Every step felt deliberate, measured, as if he could control the day simply by maintaining perfect posture. But the grief lurking inside him was unruly, breaking through his usual countenance in jagged, changeable bursts. He noticed, nearly with vexation at his own vulnerability, how the sight of the casket fading into the ground made his casket strain, and the sting of gashes he refused to exfoliate hovered to overflow. Brooke traced near before, her heels clicking vocally against the wet pavement. She drew in a jouncing breath, tasting the cold rain on her lingo. Moment, nothing felt predictable. Indeed, the rain sounded like an unpleasant meddler, washing over a world that had always been precisely curated to suit the Forrester image. She had faced storms before, media dishonors, business backstabbings, family backstabbings, but this was different. Death had a clarity that no commercial designing could ever compete. It left no room for power plays or precisely articulated accommodations. It left only raw, undressed emotion, and Brooke, for the first time in decades, felt unarmed. Steffi walked slightly piecemeal from her parents, her fleece drawn tightly around her such like armor. She was acutely apprehensive of the eyes upon her, the subtle ganders from musketeers, extended family, and business associates likewise. She had always known the world watched the Forresters nearly, but moment, the scrutiny felt invasive, nearly painful. Every expression she made, every gas she allowed to fall, was magnified, entered, and anatomized. And yet, beneath the performative grief, she scuffled with private torment, remorse, undetermined conflicts, and the weight of opinions she could no longer undo. The burial had been a glass of their lives, beautiful, precisely constructed, and yet riddled with cracks that only anguish could reveal. Inside the tabernacle, the atmosphere was a strange combination of reverence and pressure. The mourners, though united in grief, carried their own baggage. There were old battles lurking beneath polite nods, rumored resentments hiding behind soft grins. Indeed, in death, the dynamics of power and influence threaded through the gathering like an unnoticeable current. Ridge felt it more acutely than anyone. He could smell the subtle conflicts, the cock of a head, the narrowing of eyes, the way someone avoided meeting his aspect. These small, nearly inappreciable signs spoke volumes about the fractures in his family and among their associates. And he realized, with an uncomfortable certainty, that the loss had stripped down pretenses, leaving the verity exposed. The service had been pointed with citations that, while sincere, also carried the implied weight of secrets. Musketeers spoke of liberality and kindness, of the quiet heroics that had gone unnoticed during the chaos of everyday life. But for the Forresters, those stories were tempered by memory, by the sharp edge of what had been left unsaid. Ridge recalled arguments that had no way been resolved, letters no way transferred, justifications no way made. Brooke felt the sting of opinions she had made in haste, each one redefined with painful clarity. Steffi, though outwardly composed, grappled with her own internal reckoning, questioning the choices that had defined her majority and the connections that had been strained, occasionally irreparably, along the way. After the casket was lowered, the mourners gathered outdoors, forming small clusters of discussion, their voices muted beneath the missile. Ridge stood with his hands clasped behind his reverse, watching the rain ripple across the pavement like time itself. He allowed about the heritage of the person they had just laid to rest, not the public accolades, the captions, or the accolades, but the private moments that had defined them. And he realized that while they mourned one life, the echoes of that life would continue to shape their own, whether they were ready or not. Brooke approached him cautiously, feeling the nearly glamorous pull of participated grief. "Ridge," she began, her voice tentative, and also faltered. She was unsure if the words could convey the admixture of anguish, guilt, and love that churned inside her. Ridge didn't respond incontinently. He turned his aspect to the horizon, rain trickling from the brim of his fleece, and allowed himself a moment of vulnerability, a brief acknowledgement that they were both hurting in ways that words couldn't reach. Steffi, meanwhile, wandered toward the theater outside the tabernacle, seeking a private space amid the public mourning. The petals of a lily cleaved to the wet lawn, driblets adhering like gashes firmed in time. She deigned to encounter her fritters over the delicate flower, feeling the fragility and adaptability intertwined in its actuality. In that moment, she contemplated the incongruity of her own life, the strength she cultivated, the armor she wore, and the mortal vulnerability that she couldn't deny. Death had a way of exposing those trueness, laying them bare for all who watched to look. Inside the tabernacle, exchanges among the extended Forrester family revealed the complications that had always was beneath the face. Donna, ever the interceder, tried to bridge gaps, offering gentle compliances that were met with varying degrees of receptiveness. Eric, whose presence was both fostering and enigmatic, spoke sparingly, letting the moments of silence convey as important as his words might have. Indeed, in a room filled with eloquent, fulfilled individualities, grief had a leveling effect. The typically rigid scales of business and social standing fell down, revealing the raw humanity beneath. But the tranquility of participated mourning couldn't last. As the guests began to disperse, the pressures lurking beneath the face began to rise. Ridge tasted it in the subtle sidelong ganders changed between business associates, the careful delving questions about the future of the company, the counter-accusations for heritage and control. Brooke noted it in the way some family members dallied near the auto, their expressions nearly too calculating, too precise to be motivated by simple condolence. Steffi, with a keen mindfulness honed by times of navigating the intricate dynamics of her family, honored the prelude to conflict, the fragile balance of emotion and ambition poised to cock with the fewest provocation. Latterly, in the sequestration of the Forrester manse, the family gathered in the great room, the rain now softened to a gentle mizzle against the windows. Exchanges were careful at first, measured, as if testing the waters of civility. But grief, formerly stirred, is infrequently contained, and soon pressures erupted into subtle arguments, the kind that only those who knew each other privately could understand. Ridge and Brooke set up themselves reconsidering one's opinions, Steffi and her father counted in on matters of fidelity, and Eric observed quietly, a guard against chaos. Every word, every vacillation, every regard was invested with layers of meaning, history, and implied emotion. The day extended into evening, murk stretching across the manse as the family navigated both grief and undetermined conflicts. Ridge retreated to his study, seeking solace in the familiar order of his terrain, but the silence was suffocating. He examined photos, letters, and memorials, each one a memorial of a life that had been participated and lost, of moments that couldn't be reclaimed. Brooke moved to the theater, the rain having subsided to a gentle mist, and allowed herself a rare moment of soul-searching, allowing about choices she had made, words she had left unsaid, and the tenuous thread of connection that still held the family together. Steffi, ever watchful, wandered the corridors of the manse, recycling her own complex passions while observing the subtle shifts in her parents' address. By evening the family reconvened in the great room, their exchanges now pigmented with a blend of prostration, grief, and conditional conciliation. There were moments of silence, pauses pregnant with reflection, where each person considered the counter-accusations of loss, not just the immediate anguish, but the ripple goods that would shape their connections, opinions, and futures. Ridge eventually allowed himself a deep breath, admitting the ineluctability of change, the permanence of absence, and the enduring nature of love, indeed in its most complicated forms. Brooke, sitting beside him, offered a quiet nod of solidarity, a silent protestation that despite the fractures, the bonds that held them together were unbroken. Steffi, watching her parents, felt a measure of peace, tempered by the recognition that grief was an ongoing trip, not a destination. In the quiet fete, as night fell over Los Angeles and the manse stood cloaked in darkness, the Forresters were left with a necessary verity. Life was transitory, changeable, and fragile. But it was also flexible, full of moments of clarity, connection, and love that endured indeed in the face of loss. The burial had left them speechless, yes, but it had also awakened a deeper understanding of what truly signified the ties that bound them, the recollections that shaped them, and the courage needed to navigate the uncertain terrain of life and family. Indeed, as they retired for the night, the echoes of the day dallied, the sound of rain against the windows, the memory of a flower in the theater, the implied words that hung in the air. Hereafter would bring new challenges, new exposures, and maybe new conflicts. But for now, the Forresters rested in the fragile, transitory solace of participated grief, apprehensive that their lives would no way be the same, yet strengthened by the veritably vulnerabilities that the burial had revealed. In the end, the silence left by death had spoken volumes, leaving each of them ever changed, and yet inexorably bound together. As the night strengthened, an uneasy quiet settled over the Forrester manse. Though the rain had stopped, the air remained heavy, laden with the residue of grief and implied trueness. Ridge stood at the edge of the deck, gaping at the megacity lights blurred by the mist, his studies a distraction of remorse and responsibility. He couldn't shake the feeling that the burial hadn't just marked an ending, but exposed fractures in the family that might no way completely heal. Brooke joined him quietly, her hand brushing against his arm in a gesture that spoke of participated anguish, yet suggested at the swings of undetermined pressure between them. Inside, Steffi dallied in the study, digging through old letters and photos, a ritual that had always brought her near to her roots and reminded her of what had been lost. Each image sounded to brute secrets, each note a memorial that family, no matter how tightly knit, carried its murk. And as the manse settled into darkness, the Forrester heritage, its wealth, influence, and complex connections, felt both fragile and imperishable, an incongruity that would shape the days to come. Nearly in the stillness, they all knew that grief had opened doors they couldn't yet close.